I knew something was wrong before I even turned into my driveway. You ever get that feeling where your stomach notices a problem before your brain does? That's exactly what happened to me that night. It was a little after midnight, the kind of quiet suburban night where everything feels staged somehow. Porch lights glowing on empty streets, sprinklers ticking in the distance, curtains closed just enough to make you wonder who's still awake behind them. I was tired. I'd spent 2 days out of town handling a construction project in another county, and all I wanted was to get home, kiss my wife, and sleep for about 12 hours straight. Instead, my headlights landed on a wall. Not a metaphorical wall. An actual 6-foot wooden fence stretched straight across my driveway. I slammed on the brakes, so my coffee cup flew off the passenger seat. For a second, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong house. I sat there staring through the windshield while the engine idled. The cedar boards looked brand new, almost glowing under the headlights. Fresh concrete surrounded the posts. Somebody hadn't just built this thing. They'd built it recently. Then I saw the notice. A laminated sheet attached, right in the center. It fluttered slightly in the breeze like it was proud of itself. Property access restriction authorized by community board, I remember laughing. Not because it was funny, because sometimes when something gets stupid enough, laughter is the only thing your brain has left. I got out of the truck and walked toward the fence. The smell of fresh cut wood was still hanging in the air. My driveway, blocked. The same driveway my father used when he bought the house back in 1982. The same driveway where my daughter learned how to ride a bicycle. The same driveway where my son accidentally backed his first truck into a mailbox. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every barbecue, every late night grocery run. 40 years of family history. And now somebody had decided they could simply erase it. At the bottom of the notice was a phone number. I called immediately. 3 rings. A man answered. Community office. His voice was calm. Too calm. I said, "Who approved a fence across my driveway?" There was a pause. Then he said, "I'm guessing this is Ethan Carter." The way he said my name made my skin crawl. Like he'd been expecting the call. "Who is this?" I asked. "This is Randall Pierce, board president." Of course it was. Randall. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to understand Randall. Every neighborhood has one. The guy who gets a tiny amount of authority and starts acting like he was appointed governor. Randall loved rules, loved meetings, loved telling people what they couldn't do. 2 years earlier, he tried banning basketball hoops visible from a street. The year after that, he proposed fines for homeowners whose lawns weren't consistent with community standards. Nobody liked him. Most people just didn't feel like arguing with him. I happened to be one of the few who did. 6 months before the fence appeared, I'd stood up during a community meeting and publicly challenged one of his newest proposals. He wanted mandatory landscaping upgrades. Thousands of dollars worth. I remember saying, "People are trying to afford groceries, Randall. Maybe let's not worry about whether their bushes look prestigious enough." The room laughed. Randall didn't. He smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile people make when they're amused. It was the kind they make when they decide they'll deal with you later. Standing there beside that fence, I suddenly remember that smile. "Your driveway crosses association property," Randall explained over the phone. "No, it doesn't." The board reviewed the matter. The board isn't the county. Another pause. Longer this time. Then he said something that would end up costing him more money than he could possibly imagine. "The board has determined your access rights are no longer valid." Determined. I actually looked around to make sure I hadn't accidentally stepped into a comedy sketch. Imagine waking up one morning and deciding county property law was now whatever your neighborhood committee wanted it to be. I told him there was a recorded access agreement attached to my property. He dismissed it instantly. The board's legal interpretation differs. Legal interpretation. That phrase kept bouncing around my head. Not because it impressed me, because it sounded rehearsed. Like this conversation had happened before. Like somebody had already convinced themselves they were right. Finally, he said, "If you'd like access to your property, you may apply for alternate entry through the East Maintenance Road." Apply. To enter my own property. The East Maintenance Road wasn't even a road. It was basically a muddy service trail behind a drainage ditch. Half the year you needed a truck just to get through it. I looked at the fence again. Fresh concrete. Fresh lumber. Fresh arrogance. And right then, standing alone under the glow of my headlights, I realized something important. This wasn't about land. It wasn't about access. And it definitely wasn't about community rules. This was personal. Somewhere along the way, Randall had stopped seeing me as a homeowner and started seeing me as a problem. What neither of us knew yet was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because around 2 o'clock that morning, unable to sleep and fueled by equal parts anger and stubbornness, I walked into my garage, pulled down a dusty storage box that hadn't been opened in years, and started digging through old family records. And about 30 minutes later, buried underneath tax documents, faded photographs, and paperwork older than some of my neighbors, I found something that changed everything. It was an old folder. Nothing special to look at. The corners were bent. The paper inside had started turning that faded yellow color old documents get after decades sitting in storage. And honestly, if I hadn't been angry enough to tear apart half my garage that night, I probably never would have found it. But there it was. An original recorded access easement. Signed. Stamped. Filed with the county. Bill Manon. I sat at my kitchen table staring at it while the coffee machine gurgled in the background. The house was completely silent. My wife, Megan, was asleep upstairs. The dog was curled up near the back door. And for the first time since seeing that fence, I felt calm. Not happy. Not relieved. Just calm. Because the situation had changed. Up until that moment, I thought I was fighting a disagreement. Now I realized I was holding proof. And proof changes everything. Monday morning, I drove straight to the county records office. The building looked exactly how government buildings always look. Fluorescent lights, faded flooring, people carrying stacks of paperwork thick enough to stop a bullet. I handed the easement documents to a woman behind the counter named Sandra. She adjusted her glasses, looked through the pages for about 30 seconds, then looked back at me. Wait, she said. They physically blocked this access point? I nodded. Her expression immediately changed. Not outrage. Not surprise. More like the expression a mechanic gets when someone says they poured cooking oil into their engine because they thought it would save money. The kind of look that says, you have no idea how bad this is. She disappeared into a back office. 5 minutes later, she returned with another employee. Then another. Suddenly, 3 county workers were studying my paperwork. Nobody seemed confused. Nobody seemed uncertain. And that was the first clue that Randall had made a serious mistake. One of them finally said, "Sir, this easement is still active." I couldn't help smiling. Yeah, I said. That's what I thought. According to county procedure, they opened a formal review that same day. By Wednesday afternoon, I was standing at the end of my driveway beside a county inspector named Victor Delgado. Victor looked exactly like someone you'd want handling situations like this. Late 50s, sunburned neck, heavy work boots. The kind of guy who'd probably spent 30 years dealing with people making terrible decisions. He walked the property line slowly while looking at maps on a tablet. Measured distances, checked markers, compared survey records. Then he stopped, looked at the fence, looked at me, and shook his head. Oh man, that was all he said at first. Just those 2 words. Oh man. Then he laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh people make when they discover a problem much bigger than expected. What? I asked. Victor pointed toward one corner of the fence. Your HOA didn't just block your easement. What do you mean? He zoomed in on a map, then turned the screen toward me. They crossed in a county right-of-way. I blinked. How much? Enough. That answer didn't sound good. Victor continued walking, checking measurements, taking photos, typing notes. About 10 minutes later, he stopped again. This time his expression had changed completely. The amusement was gone. Now he looked annoyed. You've got to be kidding me. What happened now? He pointed toward the cul-de-sac. This access corridor is tied into emergency vehicle clearance. I stared at him. What exactly does that mean? It means if emergency responders need this route, the fence potentially interferes with legally protected access. I remember standing there for several seconds trying to process that, because suddenly this wasn't a neighborhood argument anymore. This wasn't Randall throwing a tantrum. This wasn't an HOA power trip. This was government compliance territory. Liability territory. The expensive kind. Victor eventually looked at me and said something I'll never forget. Your board president must be getting terrible advice. I almost laughed. The funny thing was I wasn't sure Randall was getting advice from anybody. I think he genuinely believed he could do whatever he wanted. And that's a dangerous mindset when paperwork starts showing up. 2 days later, the county posted an official violation notice. Bright orange, impossible to miss. They attached it directly to the community information board near the neighborhood entrance, right underneath an announcement for the annual summer barbecue. I drove by it twice just to make sure it was real. The notice gave the HOA 30 days to remove the obstruction or face escalating penalties. And that's when the mood shifted. Fast. The first voicemail from Randall arrived later that afternoon. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the smugness. His voice suddenly sounded strained. Ethan, we're reviewing several legal questions and may need additional time to evaluate the situation. Interesting. A week earlier, he sounded like a king. Now he sounded like a man discovering gravity. The second voicemail arrived the next morning. Then another. Each one a little more nervous than the last. Meanwhile, the neighborhood rumor machine exploded. Now, if you've never lived in a suburban neighborhood, let me explain something. Information spreads faster than Wi-Fi. By the end of the week, everyone knew. The fence, the county violation, the easement, the investigation, everything. People started slowing their cars when passing my house. One woman walked her golden retriever past the property 4 times in a single afternoon. Not because the dog needed exercise, because she needed updates. My neighbor Frank stopped me while I was getting the mail. Frank was retired, 70 years old, spent half his life fixing airplanes. He lowered his voice like we were discussing classified government secrets. Did Randall really block county access? I nodded. Frank stared toward the fence. Then he whispered, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." And coming from Frank, that meant something. The funniest part was discovering how many people already disliked Randall. For years, they tolerated him. Not respected him. Tolerated him. There's a difference. One family got fined because their trash cans were visible for an extra day after a storm. Another homeowner received a warning over holiday decorations. A widow down the street got cited because flowers in her garden supposedly violated aesthetic guidelines. Nobody forgot those things. People just waited, and now they smelled blood in the water. That's the trap controlling personalities always fall into. They mistake silence for support. But silence is often just patience. Eventually, consequences arrive. And when they do, everybody suddenly remembers every reason they never liked you. About 10 days after the county notice appeared, I came home from work and found 3 HOA board members standing beside Victor near the fence. And right in the middle of them stood Randall. Even from a distance, he looked exhausted. His shirt was wrinkled. His tie hung crooked. The confident community leader routine was gone. I parked across the street and watched. Victor was holding maps, pointing, explaining. Randall was arguing, at least trying to. As I walked closer, I heard him say, "We acted in the best interest of the neighborhood." Victor didn't even blink. The neighborhood doesn't supersede county law. Absolute perfection. I almost wanted to frame that sentence. Randall noticed me approaching and immediately changed tactics. His entire tone shifted. Suddenly, he wanted cooperation. Suddenly, he wanted compromise. Suddenly, he wanted to be reasonable. Funny how that works. "Ethan," he said carefully, "perhaps we can discuss a temporary shared access solution." I stopped walking, looked at him, then looked at the fence, then back at him. "You mean my driveway?" The silence that followed was beautiful. One board member stared at his shoes. Another looked away completely. Nobody wanted eye contact. Nobody wanted ownership. And right there, standing beside that ridiculous fence, I realized something important. The county wasn't going to be the thing that destroyed Randall. The paperwork wouldn't do it. The fines wouldn't do it. What was destroying him was something much worse. Public embarrassment. Because in neighborhoods like ours, reputation is currency. And Randall had just spent every penny he had. What I didn't know yet was that the legal fight was only beginning. Because while the county was busy dealing with the fence, my attorney was preparing something that would hit the HOA where it hurt most. Their wallet. By the time the county's deadline was getting close, the fence had already become the most talked about thing in our neighborhood. Not kids playing in the park. Not rising property values. Not the upcoming community barbecue. A fence. One stupid fence. And somehow that fence had turned into a symbol of everything people were tired of. A few days after my conversation with Randall, I met with my attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Lawson who had the rare ability to sound polite while completely dismantling someone's argument. I laid everything out: the easement, the photographs, the county reports, the blocked access, the extra transportation costs, the emails, the voicemails, everything. She spent nearly an hour reviewing documents before finally leaning back in her chair. Then she smiled. Not a big smile, the kind lawyers make when they see a very straightforward case. "Well," she said, "they've certainly made this easier than I expected." Those are words you always want to hear from your attorney. Over the next several weeks, we filed claims related to property interference, obstruction of legal access, trespass, and the costs created by the closure. Some people told me I should let it go, that I had already won, that the county would force the fence down eventually. Maybe, but that wasn't really the point anymore. See, people often confuse accountability with revenge. They're not the same thing. If someone intentionally abuses authority and faces no consequences beyond being told to stop, what exactly have they learned? Nothing. They simply become more careful the next time. The mediation hearing took place about 6 weeks after I first found the fence. The building itself was forgettable. Gray walls, bad coffee, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look exhausted. Randall arrived with 2 board members and an attorney who looked like he hadn't slept well in months. Honestly, I felt a little bad for him. Not because of Randall, because representing Randall was probably a full-time punishment. The hearing began exactly how you'd expect. The HOA argued there had been misunderstandings, communication issues, interpretation disputes, administrative confusion, a lot of fancy words that basically translated to, "We thought we could get away with it." Rebecca let them talk. Then she started presenting evidence. One document at a time: the easement records, the survey maps, the construction timeline, the county violation reports, photographs showing exactly when the fence appeared, copies of communication between board members, invoices, receipts, everything. The room got quieter with each page. At one point, the mediator removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Then he looked directly at Randall. "I genuinely don't understand why the board believed this action was legally enforceable." Nobody answered, because there wasn't a good answer. There never had been. The truth was simple. Randall got angry. Randall had power. Randall confused power with permission. And then Randall built a fence. Eventually, the HOA folded. Completely. The settlement included financial compensation for damages, legal expenses, and costs associated with the blocked access. The easement protections were formally reaffirmed and updated through the county. The fence removal costs landed entirely on the HOA. And because they had delayed compliance while arguing with county officials, additional penalties piled up along the way. That part created a very interesting side effect. Neighborhood dues went up. Nobody was thrilled about that, especially after everyone learned why. It's amazing how quickly support disappears when someone's ego starts costing people money. But the most ironic part came later. During the county review process, officials clarified several access designations connected to the original easement corridor. Without getting too deep into the technical details, Randall's attempt to gain more control over access ended up triggering legal reviews that actually reduced certain exclusivity advantages the neighborhood had enjoyed for years. In other words, his grand plan achieved the exact opposite of what he wanted. I've always thought life has a strange sense of humor. Sometimes karma doesn't arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives disguised as paperwork. A month after the fence finally came down, I drove home from work one evening just before sunset. The gravel crunched beneath my tires. The same gravel my father had helped maintain for decades. The same gravel my kids had played on growing up. Nothing looked different. The driveway was open. The houses were the same. The trees were the same. The world had moved on. Yet somehow everything felt different. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Randall standing across the street near a mailbox. For a brief second, our eyes met. A year earlier, he probably would have walked over and started talking. Now, he looked away almost immediately. I couldn't help myself. I waved. Just a friendly little wave. Nothing rude. Nothing dramatic. The kind of wave neighbors give each other every day. He nodded once and turned back toward his house. And I have to admit, there was something strangely satisfying about that moment. Not because I hated him. Honestly, I didn't. By then, I mostly felt sorry for him, because somewhere along the way, he became so obsessed with winning a personal battle that he lost something much bigger: respect. Once people lose trust in your judgment, it's incredibly difficult to get it back. The fence eventually disappeared. The paperwork got filed away. The legal fight ended. But the lesson stayed with me. In fact, it changed how I look at authority altogether. Not just HOA boards. Any authority. Because the real danger isn't power itself. The real danger is when people become emotionally attached to power. That's when rules stop being tools and start becoming weapons. That's when disagreement starts feeling like disrespect. That's when enforcement turns personal. And the scary part is how ordinary it all looks from the outside. Nobody was yelling. Nobody was throwing punches. There were no dramatic courtroom speeches. Just meetings, emails, votes, letters, notices, paperwork. A perfectly civilized process that almost succeeded in taking away a legal property right. That's why I tell people this whenever they ask about the story. Don't automatically trust official language. Don't automatically fear official language either. Read the documents. Check the records. Verify the facts. Because confidence sounds impressive until it collides with reality. And reality usually wins. Looking back, the thing that defeated Randall wasn't anger. It wasn't threats. It wasn't some dramatic act of revenge. It was patience, documentation, persistence. He expected outrage. He expected surrender. What he didn't expect was someone willing to quietly verify every claim and force every decision into the light. Turns out that's a lot harder to fight. Even today, every now and then, I'll catch someone glancing toward my driveway when they pass by. Maybe they're remembering the story. Maybe they're wondering what they would have done in my position. Honestly, I don't know. Everyone likes to imagine they'd fight back. But conflict is exhausting when it's happening to you, especially when it follows you home. Still, if there's one thing this whole mess taught me, it's that some things are worth defending. Not because they're valuable, because they're yours. Now I'm curious what you think. If you came home tonight and found a 6-foot fence blocking your driveway with an official-looking notice hanging from the middle of it, what would your first move be? Would you try to negotiate? Call a lawyer? Contact the county? Or would you do something that would instantly turn you into neighborhood legend status for the next 20 years? Let me know down in the comments, because honestly, after everything that happened, I'm still amazed at how some of the biggest battles in America happen in the quietest neighborhoods. And sometimes all it takes to expose a power-hungry person is one bad decision, one stubborn homeowner, and one fence that never should have been built in the first place.